She looked at me and said words I can't forget. "You can't hide it from me." And in that moment, everything changed. Broken heart, fearful face the first time I noticed her. It was almost accidental. The late afternoon sunlight streamed lazily through the cafe's tall windows, brushing the wooden tables in soft gold. She sat alone at a corner table, a book open in front of her, but she wasn't really reading. Her gaze kept drifting to the window, to the street outside, as if she were searching for something she couldn't name. There was a calmness about her, a quiet gravity that made everything around her feel slower, softer, somehow more real. I couldn't look away. She was in her early 40s, I guessed, and yet there was a grace in her that made her presence impossible to ignore. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle shift of her shoulders as she leaned back, the tiny smile that lingered even when her eyes seemed distant. It all drew me in. I felt a strange mix of awe and guilt. Awe at the quiet magnetism she carried without effort, and guilt because I knew I shouldn't be staring, shouldn't be so captivated. But there was something in her vulnerability, hidden beneath her composed exterior, that whispered to the part of me that longed to protect, to understand. I ordered my coffee and found a seat a few tables away, hoping to keep my distance but failing to resist stealing glances. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and a faint hint of vanilla, and for a moment, I imagined that the warmth in the air was somehow tied to her presence. When she shifted slightly to reach for her cup, our hands brushed against the polished surface of the table. A jolt ran through me, subtle but undeniable. She looked up, caught my eye, and for a heartbeat, our gazes held. There was a recognition there, fleeting, silent, unspoken, that made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just the light, the angle, the way the world sometimes tricks you into thinking you feel more than you do. But even as I tried to focus on my own coffee, my mind kept returning to her. The gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled, the way her fingers traced the edge of the book as if memorizing every contour, the quiet steadiness of her breathing that somehow made the noise of the cafe fade. In that first encounter, nothing was said beyond polite smiles and nods. Yet I felt a connection deeper than words could explain. I felt drawn into a rhythm that belonged solely to her and me, even though she didn't know I existed yet. And when I left the cafe that day, the sunlight now fading into evening, I realized something unsettling. I had already begun to care. Her presence lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't forget. Every small detail, every imperceptible gesture, haunted me in the quiet hours afterward. I knew then that meeting her wasn't just chance. Somehow, it felt inevitable. Somehow, I knew she was going to change the way I felt about everything, even before I understood why. It wasn't planned, that first real conversation. It almost felt accidental, but looking back, I think neither of us would have avoided it if we tried. I had returned to the same cafe the next afternoon, hoping to catch another glimpse of her. And there she was, sitting at the same corner table, her book open but largely ignored. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was that quiet acknowledgement again, like recognition in the middle of a crowded, busy world. Then, the little accident happened. My elbow bumped the edge of my cup, just as she reached for her own. Coffee didn't spill, but the sound of it clinking against the table drew her attention. "Careful," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. I muttered an apology, and that was all it took, a crack in the wall between us. "You come here often?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. I wasn't sure if it was meant casually or if she was teasing, but I felt my pulse quicken. "I guess. I like the quiet," I said, gesturing vaguely to the sunlit cafe. She nodded, eyes briefly flicking to the warm glow on the wooden floor, as if assessing whether I was sincere. There was something about her presence that made everything else fade into background noise. The soft hum of the espresso machine, the chatter of other patrons, even the distant honk of traffic outside. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and comforting, subtle enough that it didn't announce itself but lingered in the edges of my senses. It made me aware of her in a way that went beyond sight. She smiled then, a small curve of her lips, not for anyone else, not for the world, but just for me. And I realized how easy it was to lose myself in her. The way she leaned slightly forward as she spoke, the tilt of her head, the gentle movement of her hands. Every gesture was fluid, purposeful, intimate, though nothing physical had yet happened. Even in casual conversation, she had a way of pulling attention to the quiet spaces between words. At one point, her hand brushed mine while passing a notebook across the table. A spark ran through me, subtle, but impossible to ignore. I froze briefly, aware of the warmth that lingered where our skin had met. She didn't pull away. Her gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and I could almost hear her unspoken question. Do you feel it too? We laughed together over trivial things. A mispronounced word, a shared observation about a stranger's clumsy attempt to balance a tray, but the laughter carried weight. It was intimate, a bridge between strangers that neither of us wanted to burn. I found myself leaning in slightly, as if my body knew before my mind did that I wanted to be closer, even just a little. By the time we left the cafe, the conversation had already imprinted itself in my memory. I remembered the warmth of her hand, the way her eyes held mine longer than necessary, the quiet gravity of her presence. I felt both exhilarated and unnervingly aware of the unspoken tension. It was clear neither of us could ignore it. Something was stirring between us, fragile but undeniable, and I knew that this first conversation was only the beginning. After that first conversation, the world seemed subtly different whenever I knew she might be nearby. Our encounters weren't dramatic. They were quiet, fleeting, often accidental. Yet each one left an impression, a lingering pulse in my chest I couldn't shake. We began to notice each other in shared spaces. The library, where she would run a finger along the spine of a book before sliding it from the shelf. The small art gallery downtown, where her eyes lingered on paintings with a careful appreciation that mirrored my own. And in each space, though words were sparse, the tension between us hummed like a low, steady chord. There was a particular afternoon in the park that I remember vividly. She was sitting on a bench, sunlight filtering through the leaves and playing in streaks across her hair. I came to pass, and for a moment, we simply observed each other, silent acknowledgement without a single word. She looked at me briefly, then smiled just enough to make me aware of her attention. The rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, even the faint breeze brushing past, all faded into the background, leaving only the quiet intimacy of our shared presence. Small gestures became charged with meaning. The brush of her shoulder against mine as we reached for a book at the same time, the way she adjusted the strap of her bag and inadvertently brought her hand near mine. Every movement seemed deliberate, though natural. I noticed the warmth of her fingers when they nearly touched mine, and the subtle tremor in her wrist as she shifted. Even a simple laugh, soft and unexpected, made my chest tighten. There was a curious rhythm to our interactions, a blend of hesitation and comfort. She would share an observation about something trivial, the odd pattern of clouds, the smell of rain on asphalt. And I would respond, noticing not just the words, but the way her lips curved, the gentle lift of her brow, the soft tilt of her head. Each moment seemed to carry a weight, a tension I couldn't name, but that I longed to explore. I found myself analyzing her expressions, trying to decipher what she might be thinking. There were fleeting flashes of vulnerability, a sigh as she watched a child chase a kite, a pause before answering a question, a distant look that made her seem both closer and farther away at the same time. I wondered what she hid behind her poised exterior, what stories her quiet movements told. And in that curiosity, I felt a connection deeper than casual attraction, a sense that I wanted to know her fully, gently, without rushing, without pressure. By the time we parted, our closeness was both subtle and undeniable. I could feel it in the lingering glances, the unspoken acknowledgement of our growing bond. Even the smallest touch, a hand brushing against mine, a shoulder nudging slightly as we passed, was enough to send my heart racing, to remind me that between us, something delicate yet significant was forming. Those silent moments were more powerful than words. Each one deepened the unspoken understanding between us, revealing an intimacy that was quiet, tentative, but undeniably real. And every time I walked away, I carried the memory of her presence like a soft ache, a mixture of longing, wonder, and a growing certainty that this connection, however subtle, was beginning to define everything I felt. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made the world feel smaller and more intimate. We had found ourselves on a park bench after a long walk, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and violet as the sun began its descent. I could hear the distant laughter of children fading into the hush of twilight, the faint rustle of leaves overhead, the steady rhythm of her breathing beside me. Everything else seemed to exist only in contrast to her presence, her nearness, the warmth of her shoulder brushing against mine, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in the air. We hadn't spoken much. Neither of us needed words for a while. The silence was comfortable, but charged. My heart had been quietly hammering ever since we'd sat down, an unrelenting awareness of the closeness, the subtle heat of her body so near to mine. Then she turned her gaze toward me, and for the first time that day, I felt the weight of her eyes in a way that made my chest tighten. "You can't hide it from me," she said, softly, almost as if she were testing the air, but with a firmness that left no room for doubt. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, searching. I froze, caught somewhere between fear and relief, guilt and exhilaration. My own feelings, the ones I had been quietly suppressing, carefully burying beneath polite conversation and casual smiles, were laid bare in those 6 words. She knew. She had always known. A shiver ran down my spine as I felt the impact of her words, not just in my mind but in my body. My hand, which had been resting on the bench beside hers, trembled slightly. I caught the faintest brush of her fingers against mine, a silent affirmation, a grounding presence, and it made my pulse spike in a way that was thrilling and terrifying all at once. The air between us felt suddenly heavier, charged with possibility. I wanted to speak, to explain, to deny, but no words seemed adequate. I was aware of the subtle quiver in her lips, the slight shift of her posture toward me, the warmth radiating from her shoulder, the way the fading sunlight kissed her hair and made the strands glow like liquid amber. Every sensory detail heightened the intensity of the moment, making it impossible to retreat, impossible to ignore what had been simmering quietly for weeks. There was a pause, long and weighty, where time seemed suspended. Neither of us moved, and yet every small gesture, the way her gaze lingered, the almost imperceptible incline of her head, the quiet press of her hand near mine, spoke volumes. The unspoken tension between us became a tangible presence, a silent conversation of desire and hesitation, of acknowledgement and restrained longing. In that instant, I realized the depth of what we had been building together. All the quiet glances, the accidental touches, the shared silences, they had led to this. Her words haunted me, but not in pain. They haunted me in their clarity, in their truth, in the undeniable pull they revealed. And as I met her eyes again, I knew with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying. Nothing would ever be the same between us. After that evening on the park bench, everything shifted between us. The words she had spoken, "You can't hide it from me," no longer hovered like a question. They became a bridge. The tension that had once made my chest ache now settled into something warmer, more steady. A connection neither of us needed to label yet, but that both of us recognized in the quiet rhythm of shared moments. We began to spend more time together, almost naturally, in ways that didn't demand explanation. There was a subtle choreography to it, sitting side by side on a rainy afternoon, sharing the protection of an umbrella, our shoulders brushing lightly as we walked down the narrow streets. I became acutely aware of the warmth of her hand when it pressed briefly against my back for balance, of the slight incline of her head toward mine when she listened, of the gentle way her hair would fall across her face, and how I wanted, without knowing it, to brush it away. One evening, We found ourselves on a quiet bench by the river, the city lights reflected in the gentle ripples. The sound of water flowing mixed with the soft hum of distant traffic, creating a cocoon of privacy around us. We didn't speak for long stretches. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, I focused on her presence. The way she tilted her head to watch the water, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the warmth of her shoulder against mine. Every detail grounded me, made the world feel smaller and safer, made it impossible to imagine being anywhere else. There were small, sensory-rich moments that carried the weight of intimacy. Her fingers occasionally brushed mine as we shared a book or passed an item between us. Sometimes she laughed softly at my comments, a sound that seemed to echo inside me, making me conscious of the pulse of her being next to mine. When she spoke about memories or dreams, I noticed the tremor in her voice, the light in her eyes, the vulnerability beneath the confidence she usually carried so effortlessly. Each revelation drew me closer, not physically, but emotionally, weaving our thoughts and feelings together in ways words alone could not capture. I also became aware of my own vulnerability, my walls gently eroding in her presence. I could admit fears and small insecurities without judgment. She listened with an attentiveness that made every word feel sacred, every glance feel understood. The emotional intimacy we were cultivating was slow, deliberate, and profound, a bond that grew from quiet observation, shared silences, and subtle touches that left an echo in the chest. By the time we parted that evening, I realized that the distance that had once separated us, the uncertainty, the hesitation, the silent fear of judgment, had softened. What remained was a connection that felt almost tangible, a warmth that lingered in my chest long after she had left. Our emotional closeness had become a shared sanctuary, a space where age, past experiences, and unspoken fears no longer dictated our bond, and where the simple act of being near each other was enough to sustain us. The evening air was soft, tinged with the scent of rain lingering from a passing shower. I found myself walking beside her along a quiet street, the city lights reflecting like scattered stars on the wet pavement. The world around us was hushed, the usual noise of life dimmed into background static, and for the first time, it felt like the entire universe had shrunk to just the two of us. She walked a step closer, just enough for the warmth of her presence to brush against me, and I felt the tension that had followed us for weeks dissolve into something steady, reassuring, and achingly tender. We stopped at a small overlook where the river curved, lights shimmering on its gentle waves. I noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the way her fingers grazed mine as if testing the space between us. Tentative, yet welcoming. I didn't move to close the gap. I let her decide the pace, knowing now that every small gesture carried its own meaning. The warmth of her hand was enough to ground me, to erase all the doubts and fears I had carried so carefully in my chest. She spoke softly about her day, about memories that made her smile, and I listened not only to her words, but to the rhythm of her voice, the cadence that made me aware of how every sound she produced seemed to linger in the air around us. Her eyes caught mine repeatedly, lingering just long enough to make my heart beat faster, each glance a silent conversation that needed no words. There was trust there, vulnerability shared without expectation, and the quiet acknowledgement that we had come, through hesitation, tension, and fear, to arrive at something undeniably true. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, letting her shoulder rest near mine. I felt the warmth radiate through the light fabric of our clothing, subtle and electric, and I realized that closeness itself had become a language between us. My fingers brushed against the edge of her hand, almost accidentally, and she didn't move away. Instead, she let the contact linger, as if to say that this space, our space, was safe, real, and meant for us alone. We didn't need to speak about what had grown between us. The emotional intimacy, the unspoken understanding, the slow and careful uncovering of each other's hearts, had said more than any words ever could. And yet, In that quiet, shared moment, everything felt complete. I could see the weight she had carried in her gaze, and now, in its stead, there was a soft glow of acceptance, a warmth that invited me to stay, to be present, to exist fully beside her. As we finally stood to leave, our hands found each other naturally. The touch was soft, deliberate, grounding. I felt her warmth, her heartbeat, the reassuring presence of someone who had once been distant but was now irrevocably close. We walked back through the city streets, the world no longer rushing past, because between us, time had slowed. Everything, the age difference, the past uncertainties, the whispered tension, had settled into quiet, profound certainty. And in that slow, unhurried rhythm, I knew that nothing could undo this. The bond we had built from fleeting glances, gentle touches, and shared vulnerability had become a quiet, lasting joy. For the first time, I felt at home, not in a place, but in her presence, and the warmth lingered long after the night had swallowed the city.